You won't believe what I'm about to tell you. Imagine walking down a quiet alley, just trying to get home after a long day, when suddenly, you hear it? A soft, barely audible cry. It's faint, almost drowned out by the distant hum of traffic. But then, it happens again. A weak, desperate wail that makes your heart stop. You turn your head, scanning the dimly lit passage between two crumbling buildings, and that's when you see it, a tiny bundle wrapped in nothing but a thin, ragged blanket tucked beside a dumpster. And just like that, you realize the unthinkable. Someone has left a newborn baby here, alone, in the freezing night. Who could do such a thing? And why? Why? Well, stick with me because by the end of this video, you're going to have the answers you've been searching for. But before we dive into this unbelievable story, let me ask you something. Have you ever felt like the world is getting darker? Like every time you turn on the news, there's another story that makes you lose a little more faith in humanity. That's why stories like this matter. Because sometimes in the middle of the worst situations, we find something unexpected, something that reminds us there's still good out there. And that's exactly what you're about to see unfold. This isn't just another news story. It's a mystery, a tragedy, and maybe, just maybe, a miracle. The moment authorities arrived on the scene, everything changed. The baby, barely hours old, was cold to the touch, its tiny fingers curled into fists, its cries growing weaker. Paramedics rushed in, wrapping the infant in warm blankets as police officers fanned out, searching the area for clues. Who had abandoned this helpless child? A desperate mother? A terrified teenager? Or was it something even more sinister? These were the questions racing through everyone's minds as the investigation began. As the hours passed, new pieces of the puzzle started coming to light. Surveillance footage, eyewitness reports, and even a strange note left near the scene, all of it pointed in one direction. But what the authorities uncovered next changed everything. And trust me, you do an OT want to miss this. The police wasted no time combing through every inch of the alley, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they searched for anything that might explain how a newborn ended up here, alone, in the dead of night. The dumpster beside the baby was half filled with rotting food and discarded scraps, the stench overpowering, but there was something else. A torn piece of fabric caught on the edge of a rusty nail fluttered slightly in the breeze. It looked like part of a coat, maybe belonging to the person who had left the baby there. Nearby, a small note had been wedged into a crack in the brick wall, almost as if it had been placed there in a hurry. When an officer carefully unfolded the damp, crumpled paper, the words scribbled inside sent a chill through him. "Please take care of her." I had no choice. There was no signature, no explanation, just those desperate words, written in uneven handwriting, as if the person had been shaking while writing them. And that's when this case took an even darker turn. Detectives immediately started pulling surveillance footage from nearby stores and traffic cameras, hoping to get a glimpse of the person who had abandoned the child. Hours of grainy footage showed nothing but empty streets and passing cars until, at exactly 2:37 a.m., a shadowy figure appeared at the mouth of the alley. The person was small in frame, moving quickly, their face hidden under the hood of an oversized sweatshirt. They held something tightly against their chest, hesitating for a few agonizing seconds before crouching down and placing the bundle on the cold pavement. The camera's angle was too high to capture any details, but one thing was clear: this wasn't a random act. The person hadn't just tossed the baby away, they had carefully set her down, adjusted the blanket around her tiny body, and then, just before disappearing into the night, they had paused. It was barely a second, but it was enough to show hesitation, maybe even regret. And that single moment left detectives with more questions than answers. Meanwhile, at the hospital, doctors and nurses worked tirelessly to stabilize the infant. She was dangerously underweight, likely born premature, her fragile body struggling against the cold she'd endured for hours. But she was a fighter. Despite everything, she held on, her tiny chest rising and falling in shallow but steady breaths. The staff nicknamed her Hope because if she could survive this, maybe there was still hope for whoever had left her behind. As word spread through the hospital, people couldn't stop talking about her. Some believed she had been abandoned out of desperation, a mother with nowhere to turn. Others weren't so sure. They whispered about the note, the eerie way it had been placed, and the fact that whoever had left her had known exactly where to put her, as if they had planned this moment long before it happened. And then, something unexpected happened. A young nurse, barely a year into her job, was holding the baby when she noticed something strange, a faint birthmark, just above her right shoulder blade. It was small, almost unnoticeable, shaped like a crescent moon. At first, it seemed like nothing. But for some reason, the sight of it sent a shiver down the nurse's spine. It felt familiar, like she had seen it before. And as she tried to push the thought away, a memory flickered in the back of her mind, something from years ago, a news story that had long been forgotten. It had been about a missing woman, a case that had gone cold after months of searching. A woman who had vanished without a trace, pregnant at the time, carrying a baby no one ever found. The nurse couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a coincidence. Could this baby be connected to that case? Was it possible that whoever had abandoned her in the alley had been hiding from something or someone all this time? She knew she needed to tell someone, but before she could, a man showed up at the hospital, asking about the baby. He wasn't a relative, nor was he law enforcement. He claimed to be a private investigator, hired to find a missing person. But the moment he saw the child, his entire demeanor changed. His expression darkened, his hands clenched at his sides as he stared at the newborn. And when the nurse asked who he was looking for, his answer sent chills down her spine. "I'm looking for a baby," he said, his voice low and measured. A baby with a crescent-shaped birthmark. And that's when she knew this was far from over. The nurse's breath caught in her throat as she gripped the baby a little tighter, instinctively shielding the tiny, sleeping girl in her arms. Something about the man's presence felt wrong, like a shadow stretching too far under the fluorescent hospital lights. His eyes, sharp and calculating, stayed locked on the infant, barely blinking. Every muscle in her body told her not to trust him. The words he had just spoken still echoed in her mind, a baby with a crescent-shaped birthmark. How did he know about that? It wasn't like the hospital had released any details to the public yet. Only a handful of people had even seen the baby up close, and yet here he was, asking about something most wouldn't have noticed unless they had been searching for it. The nurse forced herself to stay calm, her heart pounding as she carefully adjusted her grip on the baby, as if that simple movement could somehow protect the child from whatever danger had just walked through the door. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice steady despite the fear creeping up her spine. "We can't give out information about patients." She tried to keep it professional, neutral, but the man didn't seem fazed. If anything, he looked like he had been expecting that answer. He gave a slow nod, a small, humorless smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Of course," he said, slipping a business card from his coat pocket and setting it on the counter. "If anyone asks about me, tell them I was here." And with that, he turned and walked out, his footsteps eerily silent against the polished floor. The nurse exhaled shakily, glancing down at the card, half expecting it to be blank. But it wasn't. The name printed in sharp, bold letters read, Elias Mercer, Private Investigations. No phone number. No website. Just a name. And for some reason, it sent an unsettling chill through her. Meanwhile, the police were making their own discoveries, and the case was unraveling faster than anyone had anticipated. The surveillance footage from the alleyway had finally been enhanced, and while the figure's face was still obscured, one detail stood out, a flash of a tattoo on the person's wrist, barely visible beneath the sleeve of their hoodie. It was distinct, a symbol that detectives recognized immediately. It belonged to a group that law enforcement had been keeping an eye on for years, a secretive underground network that operated beneath the city, known for handling things off the record. They specialized in making people disappear. And now one of their members had been caught on camera, abandoning a newborn in the middle of the night. This changed everything. If the mother or whoever had left the baby, there was connected to this organization, then it wasn't just a case of abandonment anymore. It meant that someone, somewhere, had been trying to keep this child hidden. And if that was true, the real question wasn't just who left the baby. It was, who were they hiding her from? As the police scrambled to track down leads, something even more chilling surfaced. A detective cross-referenced the note found at the scene with old case files, running it through handwriting analysis software. When the results came back, they revealed an eerie match. The handwriting was almost identical to a woman had gone missing 3 years ago. A woman who had been pregnant at the time. A woman who had never been found. Her name was Claire Holloway. And just like that, everything about this case changed. Claire had vanished under mysterious circumstances, her disappearance making headlines for months before the media eventually moved on. No body was ever found. No clear suspects. Just an unanswered question that had haunted investigators for years. If the note truly belonged to her, then it meant she was alive, or at least had been alive long enough to give birth. But if Claire had left the baby in that alley, where was she now? Was she still out there watching? Running? Or had something much worse happened to her before she could come forward? And then, as if fate had decided to push the mystery even deeper, another unexpected twist shattered any illusion of coincidence. A hospital staff member, curious about the strange visitor from earlier, tried looking up Elias Mercer in official records. But there was nothing. No business license, no registered PI under that name. It was as if he didn't exist. And the more they searched, the more unsettling it became. The only trace of anyone named Elias Mercer led to an old, forgotten article buried deep in the archives. It was dated nearly 20 years ago and spoke of a young man who had vanished under suspicious circumstances. A man who had been investigating something he wasn't supposed to. A man who, according to the last known witnesses, had been looking for a missing child. And that's when it hit them. What if this wasn't the first time something like this had happened? What if Claire Holloway wasn't the only one? What if this newborn wasn't just abandoned, but hidden just like the others? The pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together, but the closer the truth came to the surface, the more dangerous it became. The police, now working under the assumption that Claire Holloway had been alive long enough to leave the baby in the alley, ramped up their investigation. They dug into old files, re-interviewed anyone remotely connected to her disappearance, and tracked every possible lead stemming from the mysterious private investigator, Elias Mercer. But no matter how deep they searched, they always hit a wall. Files that should have existed were missing, records that should have been easy to access were sealed, and those who might have known something either refused to talk or had vanished themselves. It was as if someone had been erasing every trace of Claire, her baby, and whatever secret she had been running from. Then, everything changed in an instant. A patrol officer stationed outside the hospital noticed a dark SUV parked across the street, its tinted windows concealing whoever was inside. It had been sitting there for hours, motionless, as if waiting for something or someone. The officer approached, tapping on the window, but before he could get a response, the vehicle suddenly sped off, tires screeching against the pavement. It was clear now that someone was watching, tracking the baby's whereabouts, making sure she never left the hospital. But why? Who was this child to them? And more importantly, what were they so desperate to keep hidden? Back at the station, detectives finally managed to track down someone who had been hesitant to talk before an old neighbor of Claire's who had moved out of the city years ago. When they reached her, she hesitated at first, her voice cautious, as if speaking Claire's name alone might bring trouble to her doorstep. But then, as if a weight had been pressing on her for too long, she broke. She told them something no one had ever reported before, something chilling. Claire had been terrified in the months leading up to her disappearance. She had confided in her neighbor that she wasn't just running from someone, she was hiding her child from them. She claimed she had discovered something bigger than herself, something dangerous. She never said exactly what it was, but she had warned her neighbor of one thing: if anything happens to me, don't believe what they say. And if you ever hear about my baby, don't let them take her. Those words sent a shockwave through the entire investigation. What had Claire discovered? Who was after her child? And had she paid the ultimate price to protect her? The detectives knew they were running out of time. Whoever had been watching from that SUV wasn't going to wait much longer. They immediately moved the baby, now officially under police protection, to a more secure location within the hospital. But the moment they did, chaos erupted. The police launched an immediate manhunt, shutting down roads, setting up checkpoints, searching every possible escape route. But they were always one step behind. It was as if the person taking the baby knew exactly how to slip through the cracks, exactly how to move unseen. And then, just when all hope seemed lost, an untraceable number sent. A single text message to one of the lead detectives. It was an address. Nothing else. With no time to waste, a team was dispatched, racing against the clock to what they feared could be another dead end. But what they found at that address changed everything. It was an old, rundown motel on the outskirts of the city. Room 214. Inside, the air was thick with tension. And there, sitting on the edge of a worn-out bed, cradling the baby in her arms, was a woman who had been missing for 3 years. Claire Holloway was alive. Her eyes, filled with exhaustion but unwavering determination, locked onto the officers as they entered. She didn't run. She didn't fight. She simply whispered, "I had no choice." And in that moment, the truth came crashing down. Claire had never truly disappeared. She had been in hiding, running from the people who had been trying to take her baby from the very beginning. People who had power, resources, and influence. People who had made sure the world forgot about her. But somehow, she had survived. And she had done the only thing she could to keep her daughter safe. She had left her somewhere she knew someone would find her, somewhere she knew the system would protect her. Because she had seen what happened to the others. Yes, the others. This wasn't the first time a child had gone missing. It wasn't the first time someone had tried to bury a truth too dangerous to be exposed. But Claire had fought back. And now, the world would finally hear her story. The authorities immediately took Claire and her daughter into protective custody. The investigation cracked wide open, revealing a dark network that had operated in silence for years. One that had stolen children, erased identities, and silenced anyone who got too close. But this time, they had failed. Because Claire Holloway wasn't just another missing person. She was a survivor. And now, she had a voice. As the story made headlines, shaking the city to its core, one final detail remained. The text message that led police to Claire, it had no sender, no traceable origin. It was as if someone from the shadows had been watching, guiding the case from a distance. Someone who had known where she was all along. And just before the number disappeared from the detective's phone, one final message appeared. There are more. And with that, the mystery was far from over.